Welcome. This is David Hume, a treatise for human nature, book 1 of the understanding. Hume in context, as we've done with most of the other philosophers we've looked at. You can read through that yourself. A key point here is both Locke and Hume are empiricists. Hume, we find an emphasis on skepticism, and I noticed there that I've written skeptic in both UK and American spellings. You're not going to get marked down for that. So if you see it as a C or a K, it's right both ways. So Locke is an empiricist, Hume is an empiricist, but also a skeptic, and Hume is an atheist, and this is really important. Locke, when he was looking for his idea of person, considers the idea of a soul, accepts that this could be what the person is. He actually dismisses the idea of a soul as an immaterial self in terms of personhood. But he doesn't dismiss the idea that there might be a soul. It's just that the soul doesn't give us personhood. David Hume is an atheist, so he doesn't accept that there is a transcendental entity, be it soul, be it God, that exists outside of time and space. And that's really important, particularly this idea of time, because in terms of his investigation of personhood or person or self, the fact that within time there is change leads to him dismissing the idea of there being a continuous self. So let's have a quick look at what we're studying. Paragraphs 1 to 4 outline the problem. He then presents us with bundle theory of identity. He doesn't call it bundle theory of identity within the text, but you would be safe to refer to bundle theory of identity. Paragraphs 5 to 14. Once he has dismissed the idea that there is a continuity of self, he then goes into asking the question, well, why do we as humans believe that there is identity, even though there is change? So he dismisses it based on the idea that there's constant change, and then says, well, why do we believe it? So in this case, he is actually heading towards a more psychological question. Keep in mind that psychology doesn't exist at this stage. Paragraphs 15 to 23, why we believe in identity and simplicity of mind. So again, why do we believe in this identity, and why do we believe that there is a simplicity of mind? Now, this word simplicity is really important that you grasp it correctly early on. Simplicity of mind to a modern ear sounds like we're being pejorative, sounds like we're saying that that person is simple, that they are maybe not that bright. But simplicity here refers to a sense of unity, singularity, perfection, in contrast to a complexity. So if we were just looking mathematically, we could say that the number 1 is simple, 10 is complex, because it's made up of 10 ones. 10 can be reduced to 1 because it's just 10 of those ones. So as we saw with Locke, Locke concluded that there is a self, there is a person, and that this person is continuous, and that this is predicated on the on a continuity of consciousness which comes about through memory. Right, let's look at what Hume says about the self. Self, or person, to use Locke's phrase, is not any one impression, but that to which all our several impressions and ideas are supposed to have reference. So he starts out going, this is what people like Locke and all these ones before me have said. They have said that there is something called self, called person, which we are, and that all our impressions, such as happiness, our emotions, happiness, sadness, or our sensations, heat, cold, have reference, i.e., I feel cold. So there is an I. There is something that feels the cold. And as he recognizes, the common idea is that this self is a distinct object, distinct from the cold, distinct from the happiness. Hume is actually going to deny this because he is an empiricist. And a sort of a more hardcore empiricist than Locke, really. Hume is going to say, well, we can see you shiver. We can see the cold. We can measure. That's the key term with empiricism. We can measure the cold. We can measure, say, your happiness or your level of distress. Or we can measure happiness or we can measure level of distress. We can't see, we can't objectively verify, that's the key term in empiricism, we can't measure the self, the distinct object. So he goes on and says, sensations such as pleasure and pain never exist at the same time. Now, some people might want to argue with this idea, pleasure and pain existing at the same time. Don't get caught up in that. What he's basically getting at is that there is pleasure and that there is a distinct line between pleasure and the next sensation, which might be pain, for example. Because there is a distinct line, there is a distinct change. So we might say that there is an I that is feeling the pleasure, but then there is a break. And then we might say that there is an I feeling the pain. But that break separates the I. So there is no longer a continuous I. There is no longer a continuous self. This question, or this point here, was actually one of the exam questions, I think, last year. So in 2019. Now, some people might want to argue that the self continues to exist, continues to experience impressions through dreams, etc. But he's not really getting into that. He would still say there are periods when you cannot remember the dreams. There are periods when you are not conscious of maybe being of sound around you, of dreams, of impressions in the mind. And during that period of not being conscious, you cannot be said to exist. Now, this harks back to what Locke himself has recognized as a problem with his own theory. For Hume, it's more than a problem with a theory of the self. It is a clear denial of self. This leads us on to paragraph 4. Now, what we're going to read about here is what has come to be known as the bundle theory. And this is the ontological theory about objecthood, in which an object consists only of a collection, bundle, of properties, relations, or tropes. Okay? Properties, relations, or tropes. So something can be made up of properties, relations, tropes. So properties might be like red colours are properties. Relations, this is an interesting one. I'm going to say cold. Now, you might say cold is a property, but someone can feel cold, someone else might not feel the cold in the same way. So cold itself is relational, and tropes are figurative, metaphorical descriptors. Let's get on to it. Paragraph 4. Things, the rest of mankind, are but a bundle or collection of different perceptions which succeed each other with an inconceivably rapidity and in perpetual flux and movement. Okay, it's really important here, having recognized that he denies that there is a self, a continuous self, it's really easy to fall into the oversimplification of saying that Hume feels that there is no identity, and that's not correct. There is identity in the instant, and there is identity of the property, of the relation, of the trope. So this is how you can have a bundle or a collection of different perceptions. So there is identity of the perception. The word perception here is covering properties, relations, and tropes. The bundle is a reference to a collection of empirically verifiable properties in the instant of verification, i.e., apple A is a bundle, red, round, juicy, hard, whatever, etc. verified in an instant and labelled apple A. However, because of change, now if you remember, you never step in the same river twice, Heraclitus, and because of Hume's problem of induction, and if you're not certain what Hume's problem of induction is, look it up. If you want to know more about the problem of induction, it was certainly one of the areas that was studied in the philosophy of science part of this course, which was in use, I think is in Unit 2 now. And there's plenty of online explanations of the problem of induction. If people are really interested, they can contact me, and I have actually a PowerPoint like this where I could go through and explain the problem of induction as well. But because of the idea of change and the problem of induction, the next instant of verification produces a different bundle, which we might term apple B, and so on. So there's no continuity of apple. There is no such identity or self as the apple. There is simply an indefinite apples, which are each instantaneous verification of the perceptions, the bundle of perceptions. The bundle you're talking about continues as being that bundle distinct from another bundle. Okay, so when we talk about apple, in terms of it being distinct from another apple, is the illusion that A and B are continuous. Very famous story, which you may have already heard, just worthwhile looking at here. There's several versions of this sort of thing. It's the blind men and an elephant. It helps to illustrate this idea of bundle theory. The story of the blind men and an elephant originated in the Indian subcontinent, from where it was widely diffused. It has been used to illustrate a range of truths and fallacies. Broadly, the parable implies that one's subjective experience can be true, but that such experience is inherently limited by its failure to account for other truths or a totality of truths. That's what this basically looks at. In various versions of the tale, a group of blind men or men in the dark touch an elephant to learn what it's like. Each one feels a different part, but only one part, such as the side or the tusk. They then compare notes and learn that they are in complete disagreement. So this is not directly about bundle theory. It has probably a larger teaching behind it, but it can help you get an understanding of what we're talking about when we're talking about these different perceptions. So here we have one man touches the hide and thinks it's a wall. One man touches the tail, thinks it is a rope. One man touches the legs, thinks it is a tree trunk. One man touches the ears, thinks it's a fan. One man touches the tusks, thinks it's a spear. One man touches the trunk, thinks it's a serpent. There's a broader teaching going on here, but what you've got there is a range of different properties, perceptions. Each man has their own perception. This is where it's tricky. From Hume's point of view, there is no elephant per se. There's only the perceptions. When we break the perceptions down to the individual perceptions, we completely lose the elephant. We end up with a string, a trunk, a wall, a fan, a snake, a spear, which of course, none of which are correct. So this is an interesting reflection on Hume's bundle theory, an interesting challenge to Hume's bundle theory. You need to go through all of this. All I'm trying to do with these PowerPoints is provide a simple background to understand the text, and then you need to explore all these little bits and pieces without me going into them in too much detail, or else these will little videos will take far too long. So let's just jump ahead. Hume's question. In paragraph 5, he asks, what gives us so great propensity, why do we do this, to ascribe an identity to these successive perceptions and to suppose ourselves possessed of an invariable and uninterrupted existence? Why do we think there is an apple per se rather than apple A, apple B, apple C, apple D, which can each be verified in the instant? Why is it that we have this need to feel a continuity of existence? So we have a distinct idea of an object, invariable and uninterrupted, apple. And we call this identity or sameness. That is the same apple. That is an apple. That is the apple. Let me put it that way. That's better. That is the apple. It's still the apple. Oh, here it is, still the apple. Why do I think, even though they were 3 different time periods, and obviously 3 different sets of perceptions? In contrast, there is a recognition of succession and relation, which we call diversity. So, first of all, paragraph 6, the first thing he says, Hume is actually reasonably simple and clearly set out. He says, first of all, there is identity in the instant. There is no continuity of identity, yet we have this idea of continuity of identity. Why do we have this continuity of identity? Let's try and work that out. And that's basically his text. Paragraph 6, he starts off and says, it is the action of imagination which creates the idea of identity. Imagination is a faculty of the mind. So the first thing is, why do we have this idea of identity? Well, we imagine it, and that comes from the mind. We don't see it, we don't touch it, we don't feel it, so it's not a sensual thing. It is created via the imagination. So what are the reasons we have for attributing identity? Resemblance, contiguity, and causation. And I've put a note there, see Hume on induction, which I used to have on a PowerPoint, on a portal for one of the schools I was teaching at. So if you're interested, please let me know and we can go through that. But resemblance, contiguity, and causation. Just really quickly, resemblance, i.e. 2 things looking similar. We can't, the difference in them is so minor that we take them to be the same. Contiguity, that they are so close together. I'm keeping this very simple. You probably want to look these words up and take ownership of them. Causation, that one causes another. If we take a person, you take yourself, you right now, if we wait a second, you probably still look like yourself, so you resemble yourself. The bundles of perceptions which made up yourself 5 seconds ago and now are contiguous. They're in a line together, so to speak. They're arranged. One bundle, then bundle A, then bundle B, then bundle C. And there is a sense in which your existence right at this instant might be said to have a causation to your existence now. Again, that's a tricky one where you're going to have to look at Hume on induction. So those are the first things he sort of recognizes in his quest for why do we come up with this idea of identity. So you should read that, you should know them out an example. Graduation is a gradual change, that if change is so slow, so gradual, that there will be an illusion of identity. Human growth. Why do we refer to you as you? Obviously, in terms of, if I go back, in terms of resemblance, you now do not look like you at, say, 6 months old. You do not resemble yourself. You might resemble a little bit, but you don't look the same. You're much bigger. Obviously, the illusion is not coming through resemblance there. Rather, it's coming through contiguity and graduation. So contiguity is one thing being placed next to another, so to speak. And because each moment of your life has been placed directly next to the previous moment, the change has been extremely gradual. People will know you because they have witnessed this change in such a gradual way. Erosion's another good example of this. So slow. We can look at a coastline and say that coastline is the same as the coastline 10 years ago. And then if you take a photo of both, put them side by side, you might realize that they do not resemble each other. The erosion has completely changed the shape of the coastline. But because that erosion was so gradual, we are happy to still talk about it as the same coastline. And then there is this idea of common end or purpose, which we've looked at Theseus' ship before, so you should be familiar with that. There's a little bit on Theseus' ship. You can look that up. Here it is again. I've actually been through this in another one of these PowerPoints. So the ship of Theseus, also known as Theseus' paradox, is a thought experiment that raises the question of whether an object which has all its components replaced remains fundamentally the same object. The paradox is most notably recorded by Plutarch, and there it is if you read it. Okay, and Aristotle's causes. I went through this in an earlier PowerPoint. You can read through there. You don't need to know Aristotle's causes, but I suppose it's worthwhile being aware that other philosophers had discussed this earlier, that Locke and Hume are, in a sense, going back to Aristotle when they're discussing these ideas. If you haven't seen the other PowerPoint, you can pause that and have a look at that. And again, this is on the same, this is also on the other PowerPoint. Back to Hume. Hume then notes that there is a difference between numerical and specific identity. So he's recognizing that we have an illusion of identity. He's recognized that that this is created by the imagination, which is a faculty of the mind. He has recognized that this is, so to speak, caused by resemblance, contiguity, and causation. And he has looked at how those three things work with some examples: the mountain, growth of a human or of a person, Theseus' ship. He doesn't actually refer to Theseus' ship, he refers to a ship from memory, but he refers to something which anyone who was familiar with this area would know, Theseus' ship story. He then says, let's have a look at this in more detail, and he notices that there's actually a difference between numerical and specific identity. For example, he gives bird noise and the example of the parish church. Now, I haven't gone through these in great detail anywhere, but you should be able to read them and understand them, hopefully. In terms of being prepared for an exam, any of these are great exam questions. If you're an examiner, you might ask, what is Hume explaining through the example of the bird noise, which would be the difference between numerical and specific identity. You might ask a question such as, how does Hume explain the idea of the expectation of change, or how the expectation of change leads to the illusion of identity? And the river example, we expect a river to change. It's part of the nature of a river to flow, to change. And because we expect it to change, we accept the change. And we, in a sense, ignore that there is change. And we talk about it being the same river, even though it is clearly changing, because we have an expectation that it will change. And causation, example, a republic or a commonwealth. Memory. So, the qualities that give rise to the idea of union or unity in the imagination are resemblance, contiguity, and causation. These are all based on memory. What I mean by that is, for me to think you, if I look at you and then I look at you 5 minutes later and I think you resemble, or the instantaneous, so I look at you and I see an instantaneous bundle of properties, and then I look at, actually I should be clear here. Let's not say I look at you, because you immediately implies that there is a distinct object. I look and I see in an instant a bundle of properties. In 5 minutes time I look and I see another bundle of properties. They resemble each other. So this leads my imagination to create an illusion of identity, of sameness between these two bundle of properties, which leads me to talk about you, self, person. How has this happened? That is because the second bundle of properties I looked at, I was able to reference them to the first bundle and say that they look the same, they resemble each other, which means I had to remember the first property or the first bundle. So resemblance is based upon memory, as is contiguity and causation. And Hume defines memory as a faculty by which we raise up images of past perceptions. Hence, Hume's theory is sometimes called a psychological theory of identity or the memory theory of identity. Here you'll see that both Hume and Locke, how are they similar? How are they different? This is, I think, section B of the exam is currently really pushing this, getting you to look at two thinkers such as Hume and Locke and saying how they're similar, how they're different, and then which do you think is right, and evaluate that. So obviously they're similar in so much as they both think that memory creates the idea of self. They're different because Locke says that this idea of self is a distinct thing, an object, and Hume says it is an illusion. As memory alone acquaints us with the continuance and extent of this succession of perceptions, 'tis to be considered upon that chiefly as the source of personal identity. Memory does not so much produce as discover, that's a really important point, personal identity, by showing us the relation of cause and effect among our different perceptions. Identity depends on the relations of ideas, and these relations produce identity by means of that easy transition they occasion. Relations of ideas, again, goes back to what's called Hume's fork. So, if again I have material on that, if people are interested, they can contact me and I will try and put something up on Hume's fork, but just there's plenty of stuff online, so just type in Hume's fork. So that is basically Hume. These are the key terms you need to know: reason, rationalism, empiricism, skepticism, identity, self, object, same subject, sameness, diversity, perceptions, bundle theory, properties, relations, tropes, ontological imagination. Don't ask me why they've stuck together, just a glitch in the matrix. Faculty, resemblance, contiguity, causation, proportion, graduation, purpose, memory, psychological theory of identity. They're key ideas that you should be familiar with, and it's really important to be familiar with the examples that he uses. With Locke, if you've had a look at any of the Locke videos I've did, you'll see I did a video on all of Locke's thought experiments and examples, and I tried to visualize them by presenting them in a much more visual way than, say, this little movie. That's a really good way of trying to remember what Hume has as well. You could go through, you could make your own PowerPoint with a picture of the mountain, really look at that mountain example from memory. One of the confusions is that some people think what he's saying is if you take a little stone off a mountain, the mountain still looks like a mountain. He's actually saying if you take a mountain off the earth still looks like the earth. That's oversimplification, but that's basically the difference and the confusion that happens with that one. So just be clear about what he's saying, not that it makes any real difference between those two. And that's Hume. I hope that's helpful.